Welcome to the Times of Israel's What Matters Now, a weekly podcast bringing you one issue that affects Israel and the Jewish world right now. I'm your host, Deputy Editor Amanda Borschel-Dan, here today with opinion columnist at the New York Times, Bret Stephens, who is also the editor-in-chief of Sapir magazine. Bret, thank you so much for joining me today.
Pleasure to be with you, Amanda. Nice to see you again.
It is always a pleasure, and I see in your backdrop that it is a lovely day in the United States. We are here to discuss what is happening in terms of the war in the U.S. I really want to feel out from you and get your perspective on how the U.S. is viewing this war, calling it Trump's war, or is it a just war? So we are going to discuss all of this and more when we're back. And we're back. I'm Amanda Borschel-Dan in Jerusalem with Bret Stephens. Bret, your columns in the New York Times are outliers, I would say, in terms of the opinions that you're voicing, both on this war, but in general, I would say. And do you view your role there as some kind of a catalyst in a way to show a different side of America?
I mean, my columns, I guess, with respect to the war in Iran are outliers among my colleagues. I don't think I'm completely alone in my view that this is not only Trump's war, it is also a just war. And I am trying to express that to an audience that is perhaps, say, more skeptical of my views than my old audience when I was writing columns for the Wall Street Journal, or of course, in a past life, for the Jerusalem Post. There is, of course, a tremendous amount of skepticism about the war, and I think it's compounded of a few elements. One is profound hostility and skepticism of President Trump, not simply for the way in which he took the country to war, where I have misgivings. I don't think he spent enough time making the case to the American people, but also because of who he is, and a broad hostility, I think a fairly unyielding hostility among most of his critics, that the guy simply can do no right. I've been very critical of Donald Trump, but I think I try to give him credit when I agree with him. Then there's skepticism about the wisdom of conflict with Iran. You hear in many quarters, including parts of Trump's base, that there was no imminent threat to the United States, that this was what they call a war of choice, and that this is going to end badly for America in terms of economic blowback, possibilities of a terrorist campaign by Iran against softer targets throughout the world, including the United States. And I find that criticism, at least at this stage, a little bit flabbergasting. The United States and Israel have, knock on wood, I should say, flown thousands of sorties, have yet to lose a single aircraft. Casualties by the standards of war have been minimal, of course tragic, but minimal. And we, with Israel, have managed to do incredible damage to Iran's long-term capacity to wage war. So yes, I am in a sense an outlier, but I hope at least part of my audience is somewhat persuadable.
Obviously, we're here with that hope in mind as well. And I'm just really curious to dive in a little bit more into the idea that Trump can do no right. And me, as an Israeli here, I see things vastly differently than an American would. I have not been in the United States since 2018. I don't understand what it is to live under Trump's America. I do understand, however, that even his electorate, even those who voted for him, the MAGA party, or I guess you can't call it a party, a MAGA movement, shall we say, philosophy, I don't know what you would call it, that they too are unhappy with the idea that America is going to war for another nation, that this is the narrative that we're hearing again and again, that America is going to war for Israel. So first of all, my question for you is, do you think America was dragged into the war by Israel?
Of course not. But before I answer that question, let me say that that is not by any means broadly true of the MAGA movement. There are prominent MAGA voices who have been very skeptical or hostile to the war. Obviously, Tucker Carlson is one. Joe Rogan, to the extent that he at least swung his support for Trump in the last election, has also voiced skepticism. But if you look at polling, the overwhelming majority of Republican voters support the war, and they support it not because it benefits Israel. They support it because they have memories that stretch back to the embassy hostage crisis at the end of the Carter administration. They remember the Beirut barracks bombings. They have not forgiven Iran for supplying Iraqi insurgents with sophisticated IEDs, which killed or maimed well over 1,000 of our service members. They understand that for the past 47 years, Iran has been waging war against the United States, and the United States has just chosen effectively not to return fire. And they see this war, as I do, not as an attempt to start yet another so-called forever war, but as an attempt to end the forever war that Iran began waging against us in 1979. I think many Americans also understand that this war is different, not because it's a war for Israel, it's a war with Israel. You know, my memory of American conflicts, major American conflicts, stretches back, now that I'm in my 50s, a few years. I remember even in the first Gulf War, when we went to war with coalition partners whose contribution was more or less symbolic, right? I mean, they'd put in a few planes. There'd be maybe a brigade of troops, even a division of troops, but it was always kind of like 90% America, 10%, Britain and whatever other countries joined us. This effort looks much more like a 50-50 effort, or at least a 60-40 effort. We have, in the United States, benefited from not only what Israel provides us with, what I'm guessing almost surely is targeting intelligence and all kinds of information that the United States hasn't been able to obtain on its own, but also a second enormous and highly capable and highly competent Air Force going after a whole range of targets that allow the United States to conduct this war with only a fraction of the forces that it would otherwise require, which means that we can still be on station in Asia, we can still be on station in Europe. So Israel is, for once, a genuine, I'd say for once, the United States has a genuine coalition partner, a genuine ally, as opposed to a fake one. Now, of course, you hear this argument on the kind of inveterately anti-Israel right, as well as the inveterately anti-Israel left, that in effect Israel hoodwinked the entire Trump administration to go to war on its behalf. That replicates, let's face it, ancient anti-Semitic tropes about clever Jews getting Gentiles to do their bidding, and the fact that there is so much prevalence in terms of this libel says something about the rise of anti-Semitism in the United States. I don't think it says anything really about the truth of the situation that we're in. When people tell me, well, Iran was not an imminent threat, my response to them is, say you go to your doctor and you get the bad news that you have stage 2 cancer. Maybe that's not an imminent threat. Maybe you should just hang out until you go back and it's stage 4. I think that analogy holds perfectly with the Iranians. What would it mean for American deterrence in the region if Iran didn't have a few thousand ballistic missiles, as it did on February 28th, but tens of thousands of ballistic missiles, making it effectively impregnable to any kind of attack? Thank goodness we're acting now rather than just waiting on events.
I love this analogy of the stage 2 cancer, and I firmly agree with you on this. I just wonder if Americans who are so unused to any kind of existential threat can really internalize that a country that is so far away, vastly different from itself, that it actually poses a threat to the U.S.
One of the arguments that I try to make in my column is that Iran is not operating by itself. You have to understand Iran as a key node in an axis that comprises Beijing and Moscow, along with the Iranians. And in that light, it really does become a much more existential threat, because we're really facing a sort of a Eurasian adversary that could, if it had continued to gain strength, really pose existential dangers to America and to vital American interests, not just in the Gulf, but also in the Indo-Pacific and in Europe as well. And removing, as I hope we end up doing, or at least substantially degrading, part of that threat, and perhaps by military standards, the weakest part of that threat, actually weakens China and it weakens Russia. Again, another point that I'm trying to remind my audience of, those drones that are hitting Kyiv are either Iranian built or certainly they're Iranian designed. The oil that supplies China and that is vital to its war machine and its aspirations to seize Taiwan or conquer the South China Sea, much of that oil is coming also from Iran. If this regime is ultimately to fall, I don't think it's going to fall in the next month or two, but I think it could fall in the next year or two. It would tremendously enhance American global security and weaken that axis that really, really should worry every American, even if Iran seems comparatively small. By the way, the same people who tell us that Iran is no threat at all are now trumpeting the fact that Trump does not seem to have a plan for controlling the Straits of Hormuz, through which, by some measures, 20% of the world's energy flows. So either Iran was no threat at all, or Iran was such a serious threat that it could actually choke much of the world's oil supply. People should choose or decide, which is it? Is it so great a threat that we can't afford to fight it, or is it such a trivial threat that we shouldn't bother to fight it? I mean, I'd like to understand what their answer to that question is.
At the end of the day, though, Bret, don't you think that for most Americans, it really matters what's happening in their pocketbook? I mean, just for some perspective, when I left the United States in 1999, a gallon of gas was, I think, something like $1.25.
Yeah.
And tell me, what are you paying now?
Well, I live in a more expensive area in terms of my gas prices. So I think it just hit the $4 mark. But by the way, it was hovering around the $4 mark for much of the Biden period during the high inflation that we had then. So first of all, a buck isn't worth, I hate to break this to you, but a buck today in America ain't worth what it was in 1999 when you left the country. There's been a very broad inflation. Secondly, people understand, generally speaking, that this is a temporary situation owing to the fact that we're dealing with a war. It doesn't reflect a general rise in prices. Thirdly, we've had $100 a barrel oil for a long time, or throughout many periods in the last, I'd say 5 or 6 years. I'd have to go back and look at the data, but it's certainly not unprecedented. The fourth thing, though, is that this is a very different reality, and it's why efforts to treat this as a return to the OPEC oil embargo fail. The last 15 years, thanks to fracking, the United States has become the world's single biggest producer of both natural gas as well as oil, I believe. So we now have a degree of energy independence that we simply didn't have back in the 1970s, or even when we went to war in Iraq in the early years of this century. And that makes a real difference because of that fracking revolution, which was opposed by the way, another irony. I remember when the price of oil used to go up, I'd hear from my friends on the left that this was a good thing because it would speed up the energy transition away from fossil fuels and to renewables. But now that they can use it as a cudgel against an administration they don't like, they're going on about this theme of affordability, which I wasn't hearing a few years ago when the issue was not Iran, but climate.
Okay, this idea of renewables and all that, put that to the side, because obviously Israel is a leader in technology, at least for this, if not in its implementation. But the common citizen who is seeing the gas prices go up, and then you compound that with the idea, as you just said, that something like 20% of the world's energy is related to this current conflict. The idea, if you remember back when George W. Bush was going after Iraq, and there were allegations that this was some kind of oil
Yeah.
war, that it was a war over oil and money and things of that nature. It seems like there's no hiding the fact that this conflict is also very related to the economy and oil. And is the American people ready to accept that as another one of the ideologies for this war?
Well, as you Israelis like to say, it's depend, and I think it's depend on how long this war goes on. If the United States is able to take control of the Strait of Hormuz, if the ships, the oil tankers start going through the straits and the bottleneck clears out, I think all this is going to be forgotten, fairly quickly. If this conflict stretches on, into the spring and then the summer, then that's a different story. Now, it is true that because Americans just went through a period of high inflation under President Biden, they're very, very sensitive to the rise in prices. I think the administration is also sensitive because they're facing a midterm where they were already dealing with stiff headwinds against a feeling that Trump had wildly overstepped as president, had misused our immigration officials to, abuse perfectly decent people, had behaved in a quasi-authoritarian manner. By the way, arguments that I myself am sympathetic to. So the administration is worried about where the midterms go, and clearly the Republicans don't want to see a long war for all kinds of reasons. I also think, however, that there is a residual old-fashioned belief that when American soldiers, airmen, sailors are in harm's way, we need to support them. We need to give them the means to fight and win. That Iran is a dangerous totalitarian adversary, and that we want to see success in this conflict. So while I hear from a lot of people who are almost openly cheering for America to fail because they hate the president or they hate Prime Minister Netanyahu, I think there is, I don't know if it's a majority, but there is a huge number, a little more silent in the American public, that wants to see this go well and wants to see our enemies defeated and wants to see the cause of freedom vindicated, and that they understand that ultimately America and Israel are engaged in a common fight for civilization against totalitarian and barbaric enemies.
I want to discuss the idea of the web, the nexus of evil, in our second half. But before we get to that, one question for you. You said the administration is concerned about the midterms. I just wonder how much US President Donald Trump is concerned about the midterms, because he is not, as far as we know so far, standing for another election. And my impression is that he's somebody who is doing what is in Trump's best interest first, and then perhaps the United States afterwards. And so the question is, what does Trump want to do in terms of this war? Not necessarily, perhaps, what's the best for the US or for the Republican Party for this war.
I have learned that it is very, very difficult to peer into Trump's mind, having tried my best to closely observe it over these past 10 or 11 years in which he's been politically engaged. The answer is, I don't know. My best guess is that he'd hate to lose the midterms because Trump hates losing. And ultimately, a resounding loss in the midterms would be seen as a verdict, a public verdict on his administration. Now, how Trump will react to it, my guess is he'll shrug his shoulders and do what past presidents, including Barack Obama, have done after they've been walloped in congressional elections. They have abused their executive powers and executive authority. I think Trump half expects that he's going to be impeached for a third time. It wouldn't surprise me if he almost welcomes it. Certainly, setting, he already has set the record in terms of the number of times he's been impeached, but maybe he wants to go for the trifecta there. But I think he also might, perhaps more shrewdly, suppose that if Democrats do get control of Congress, it will remind the American public of everything they dislike about Democrats as opposed to everything they dislike about Republicans. And it could play well in 2028. Remember, Obama was walloped in both of his midterms in 2010 and then in 2014. At least in 2010, he came back to win a fairly resounding re-election. So how this plays out politically, we have to sort of think that through. And Lord knows how Trump is thinking about this.
Right. I just wonder, everyone talks about the lame duck. For
Yeah.
me, just having observed Trump, and again, I haven't been to the United States for a long time, but I just wonder if he would find it freeing and, as you said, use or abuse his executive powers in a way that we have never seen before.
Well, I think that may certainly be the case. And as I said, that's the way past presidents have operated. Typically, if you look at the history of American presidencies, first terms are about the domestic agenda. Second terms are about the foreign policy agenda, because foreign policy is an area where the White House has a lot more leeway and constitutional authority. And again, when presidents lose control of Congress and they don't really have a domestic agenda, they want to go abroad and they want to use their pen or their auto pen, depending on on the presidency. So that's something that I think we would have expected would have happened irrespective of a war in Iran or the outcome of the war in Iran. I should say, however, that if Donald Trump, say, decides to end this war tomorrow with Iran effectively having gained a sort of control over the Strait of Hormuz, and with the regime undefeated, even if by every reasonable military standard they've been walloped, but if they can sort of raise their flag and come out and have a big celebration in the center of Tehran, that will play very ill for Trump, not only in the country at large, but among the Republican base, which is why I think he's going to pursue this war to some kind of conclusion that he can call, with at least credibility among his own base, a clear-cut victory.
Let's go to a short break. And we're back. I'm Amanda Borschel-Dan from Jerusalem with Bret Stephens. Bret, I want to play out the reverse scenario in which Iran does maintain control. And of course, we here in Israel are in a way experiencing the mock-up of that, with Hamas still in control in Gaza, Hezbollah still basically in control of southern Lebanon. And I want to hear what you think that would do if Iran were to maintain control. What would that do to the region and potentially the globe?
That's a great question. And so my own suspicion is this war is going to end probably with some kind of ceasefire in which multiple sides claim victory. Now, if the United States is able to end this war with Iran's nuclear programs visibly and irreversibly destroyed, perhaps because we seize those 200 kilograms of enriched uranium at Isfahan, or something like that. If we end the war with Iran unable to fire ballistic missiles in a way that threatens life, and I think we're already at that point. If we end the war, most importantly, with oil flowing through the Strait of Hormuz, then it will be very hard for the Iranians to convince anyone, except perhaps the 12% of the country that still supports the regime, that they won, and that they will then move forward, but as a kind of a zombified state. Imagine, for instance, that the United States seizes Karg Island, which is the spigot for all Iranian crude oil exports. Um, we will have complete control, essentially, over the budget of the Tehran regime. They will be unable to pay their civil servants. They'll be unable to pay their soldiers. And I think that even if now they are in maximum repression mode, with the Basij taking over the streets of Tehran every single night, they're going to be unable to maintain that. And in 1 or 2 years, you're going to see local uprisings in, a provincial barracks or one thing or another, and I don't see the regime surviving in the long term. Yes, Hamas still controls its 47% of Gaza, but I was just reading in the Times of Israel today that the one place where Israeli school children are coming out where they feel safest is in the Gaza envelope, where they previously, of course, were most at risk. So, in a sense, Hamas, is undefeated. In reality, it is defeated, and I think you're going to find a similar reality taking place in Lebanon too. The first signs of life in forever that the Lebanese government actually means business and wants to rid itself of Hezbollah. Unfortunately, we don't live in a time when our adversaries, dress up in coattails, come on the steps of our battleship, come to the forecastle of our battleship and sign instruments of surrender. That's not the way this particular gang of adversaries operates. But if they are unable to, in any meaningful way, menace our interests or our citizens, then I think it's fair to say we will have won, even if it doesn't have quite the satisfaction of what your prime minister calls a total victory.
If you take your cancer model again, every time we finish any kind of these conflicts with a ceasefire, the cancer still exists. It is perhaps degraded to stage 1 or stage 2, stage 3, perhaps in the case of Hezbollah. At this point, we're finding that they're a lot more fierce than we had expected. But the cancer is still there. And do you think there is any way to rout out the cancer?
You know where the cancer is not? The cancer is not in the United Arab Emirates. The cancer is not in Bahrain. The cancer is not in Morocco. Cancer is not in the Abraham Accord states that made decisions of their own, not to change their policy so much as to change their culture. And I don't think Israel is ever going to be, in this sense, cancer-free, to extend this analogy, until you see other neighboring states deciding to change their own attitudes about not just their attitude towards Israel or towards the Jewish people, but their attitudes towards moderation and modernization. I think the Middle East is divided into two camps: the axis of moderates and modernizers, and the axis of fanatics and totalitarians. And what's happening right now is that the axis of fanatics and totalitarians is collapsing, or it's if not collapsing, it's under immense strain. And so that becomes an opportunity, a better opportunity for those countries to get rid of the cancer themselves. Look, Israel has been living, in a sense, with this stage 1, stage 2, stage 3 cancer since 1948. That's just been the reality. The reality of the state of Israel is, periodically you have to fight in order to bring the cancer back from a stage 4 to a stage 1, and then it recurs and it comes back, and that's the way in which Israel has experienced 78 years almost of statehood. And in the meantime, in those 78 years, the country has thrived in ways that would have been unimaginable to the Ben Gurion, Golda Meir, Moshe Dayan generation. They would not be able to recognize the skyline of Tel Aviv. They would not understand that Israel, the country of the kibbutzim and the moshavim, has become a first world, high-tech, wealthy, at least in some areas, wealthy local powerhouse that is militarily superior to all of its neighbors, combined. So that's the reality that Israel has lived with. Maybe to use another medical metaphor, think not of cancer, but I don't know, think of diabetes. If you are conscientious about treating it, you can expect to live, a long and fruitful life. Let things get out of hand, and it will be otherwise. But but I feel like I'm investing too much effort into these now mixed medical metaphors. But the point is this: there is ultimately no final safe harbor for the Jewish people except in the continuous application of their courage and their ingenuity and their wits and their nerve to live from one generation to the next. And you know what? That's been true for 3,500 years. So if it's been true for 3,500 years, hopefully it'll be true for another 3,500. And then some.
I'd like to zoom out a little bit more. And you and I are of an age. And so you may remember, I'm not sure if you had this when you were growing up, but when I was a little girl living in Canada at the time, we had nuclear war drills.
Yes.
And we would, in school, go under our desks and cover our heads like this, because that'll definitely save you from any kind of nuclear disaster. And at that point, there was one enemy, as far as I understood it as a little girl, and that was Russia. And here we are, all these years later, and we're still looking at the globe. And as a United States citizen, I think if you were to poll the citizenry, who would be the enemy that they would point to? I mean, Russia would definitely be in the short list. And so I guess my question for you is, let's take a bit of a zoom out and talk about this nexus of evil, as I tend to think of it, and that's Russia, it's Iran, North Korea. Who else would you add to that list, Bret? Or do you think it's an accurate list?
Well, China, I guess,
China.
would be the fourth member. By the way, I was a kid growing up in Mexico City, which was an earthquake-prone area. So we did have drills, but they weren't for nuclear war. They were for earthquakes, and we were supposed to get under our desks in the event of an earthquake and a falling masonry. I think our fears were a little more realistic because we really did have these very severe earthquakes.
I just have to say before you go on that when we moved to Indiana, we used the same drills for tornadoes.
There
So
you go.
there you go.
Another also plausible, much more plausible threat, but I of course do remember the kind of the fear that even as a kid in the mid 1980s we had that the Russians are coming, and it was real because the Soviet Union was a genuine geopolitical menace, armed with tens of thousands of nuclear warheads. I think we face something that is not so much like the Cold War as it is like the era of the 1930s. In the 1930s, you had two phenomena which rhyme with the present. The one is you had a series of intense regional conflicts that eventually became a global conflict. So in 1931, Japan invades Manchuria, and you have a conflict in China. Then in 1935 or 36, Italy invades what was then called Abyssinia, Ethiopia. You have the chaos of the Spanish Civil War with Germany and the Soviet Union taking up alternate sides in that, or different sides in that conflict. The Rhineland crisis, the Sudeten crisis, Poland, and eventually with Pearl Harbor and Germany's declaration of war, all these separate conflicts spill into a single conflict. And I think you see something similar today in the sense that, we had, going back to 2014, the initial invasion of Ukraine, but especially 2022, the full-scale war in Ukraine, 2023, multi-front war between our ally Israel and its various enemies, that now expanding into a straight-on confrontation with the head of the octopus with Iran. The very real prospect as soon as perhaps next year of an attempted Chinese invasion of Taiwan. So again, like the 1930s, conflicts that appear to be separate becoming a single conflict. And the other way in which the 1930s resonate with the present is that we had a collection of authoritarian adversaries in different theaters of the world who weren't necessarily initially sympathetic with one another, but discovered that they had a common enemy in the democratic West and common interests in imposing their totalitarian vision of the world. Mussolini didn't start out as an ally of Hitler. He didn't even start out as an anti-Semite, and Mussolini had a Jewish mistress. But he eventually joined forces with Hitler, and that became one alliance. And then a few years later, Japan was added to that mix. And then, of course, between 1939 and 1941, people forget, the Soviet Union was a part of that alliance through the Non-Aggression Pact of 1939, which allowed the Soviets to invade their side of Poland. And so all of those forces also, again, remind me of the pact of unlimited friendship that Vladimir Putin signed with Xi Jinping on the eve of the invasion of Ukraine, or the strategic partnership that China signed with Iran just 4 or 5 years ago, or the close military cooperation between North Korea and Russia, in which North Korea sent thousands of troops to the Ukrainian front, or Iran's supply of drones to Russia, and what Russia was going to do, which was supply anti-aircraft missiles to Iran if the United States had it intervene. So the axis of authoritarians, if you will, have combined today just as they had combined in the 1930s, and wars are occurring in wars of great intensity are occurring around the world, which broadly pit the interests of the West against this interest of this authoritarian axis. So it is cause for real concern. I am glad that at least with Iran, the United States didn't simply wait for our enemies to become even stronger before we acted. And I dearly hope that we see this war through to some kind of, if not totally convincing, at least satisfactory conclusion, where Iran not only can't menace its region, but doesn't serve as a useful ally and nexus between Moscow and Beijing.
And okay, do you see this Iran conflict in terms of a Hollywood ending? Meaning, if the US and Israel do rout the regime, could this be the Hollywood turning point, and after this, everything will be hunky-dory and we go right off into the sunset? Or is this just one blip in this series of aggressions that you just gave us the context for?
I mean, the truth is, the part of the problem with this war is it had a kind of a Hollywood beginning, like the coup de grace, right? That usually happens at the end of the war, happened in the very first minute with a strike on Khamenei and his senior leadership. I actually think that affects our psychology about the war, because in a sense, the most stunning and decisive act came at the beginning. So everything that has followed feels kind of anticlimactic. Look, in life, there are very few Hollywood endings. Maybe the raid on Entebbe was a Hollywood ending, or the Six-Day War was a Hollywood ending, but that tends not to happen. And my guess is that at the end of this war, there will be those who opposed it from the beginning who will claim that they were vindicated, even if we regain control over the straits, even if Iran's capacity to wage war is effectively reduced to nothing. So long as elements of the regime remain in power, they will say this war fell short of the expectation, which was, as Trump put it, unconditional surrender. But life is not really about Hollywood endings. Life actually can be very good without a Hollywood ending. Life can be good if you in Israel, and also, by the way, your allies in Abu Dhabi and Dubai and Manama, can wake up and say, you know what, I don't really have to worry all that much that a drone or a missile is going to land in my high-rise apartment building, because that threat has been degraded to the point that it no longer is a realistic danger to my life and to my family and to my livelihood. And that, I think, is that would be the real Hollywood ending, which is a return to a kind of normalcy which perhaps existed on the surface especially before October 7th, but didn't really exist in reality. If Iran is going to spend the next 10 years licking its wounds until some subsequent generation of brave protesters finally gets rid of this regime, that will be fantastic. And that, by the way, that might not happen with mass demonstrations in the streets of Tehran. It might happen with a leadership decision to move on a different course, a kind of a Gorbachev option, which ends up evolving the regime into something that isn't at war with the rest of the world.
Of course, the Gorbachev option led to eventually the Putin reality.
Well, no, it happened. I'm not sure that that's the case. I don't think Putin was an inescapable, inevitable part of what happened. There was this decade or near decade of Yeltsin. That was badly fumbled, both by the Russian government at the time and also by its partners in the West. And if something like that should happen in Iran, I hope that we will learn the lessons of the 1990s and turn Iran or put Iran on a course to becoming another Poland rather than another Russia. One thing about Iran that does give me hope, Amanda, is because Iran has suffered from Islamic fundamentalism with its government for all of these many, many years, I think the Iranian people are pretty well inoculated against that particular bug. My guess is that if you had polls about pro-American sentiment in the entire Middle East, with the exception of Israel as the most pro-American country, Iran, the Iranian people, would come in a very close second. And you saw that with the cheering that occurred when Khamenei's compound was destroyed back in on February 28th. That's a very hopeful sign for the long-term future of Iran, even if we're not seeing it or feeling it at this moment.
Bret, I've taken up way too much of your time, and I just want to thank you again.
Amanda, it's always a pleasure to talk to you. I must visit the Times of Israel website 10 times a day, especially in the last few weeks.
That is staggering to hear. Thank you so much for that.
I'm half your traffic. I'm kidding. No, I'm joking. You guys are getting a lot of attention and doing wonderful, wonderful, important work with news that I do not feel is inflected one way or the other with a detectable bias. And that's a great testament to what you and David and the entire team manage to do. And when something is labeled opinion, it's labeled opinion, and I know it's an opinion. And when I'm reading the news, I feel like I'm getting it straight. And that is real journalism that you guys are doing day in and day out under exceptionally trying circumstances. So I doff my invisible hat to everyone there.
Thank you so much, Bret, for that and for everything.
Thanks a million.
And thanks for listening to the Times of Israel's What Matters Now. Please check out another installment soon. This episode was produced by Ari Schlacht. If you have any questions or comments about this or any other episode, please drop us an email to podcast@timesofisrael.com. Until next time, shalom.